Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, first and foremost, thank you so much for listening. And also, before I forget, because I forgot last week and was admonished, those of you who have chosen to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we so appreciate it and we need it. And we have every intention of continuing on in 2021, but it's a lot easier when we have your support. If you care to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, if you're in a position to do so, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. You can join the 1776 Club. There's different levels. You can decide however you want to do it. Just know that we need it and we so appreciate it. And we also really appreciate the correspondence that we get. And this week's show is proof of that, as the entire show is devoted to you, Clay, and Joe Ellis answering listener questions.
Well, questions from all over the place, including Matt of the Piedmont in Italy, and another fellow in Europe. It's extraordinary. Somebody from Britain had a question about the loyalists and how they were treated, and then we were able to get in a couple of Jefferson's anti-British jabs. It's always great.
Yeah, I hope that was Ben. I hope we didn't lose you, Ben.
Oh, no. The British can take a joke. You know, they're Greece to our Rome. So I live there. My daughter now lives there. And since they're no longer the empire on which the sun never sets, they've decided that they're Greece to our Rome, that we're the vulgarians who have all the power and money and a lack of refinement and civility, and they get to be ancient Greece to us now and be our teacher. They get to sneer at the ways in which we use our power inappropriately and so on. And so it's a great relationship for them. And the special relationship between the United States and Britain is one of the great things about this country. So no, I don't think that Ben will be upset.
Our friend from Italy, though, it was such a long letter and we didn't get all of it in, but there is one segment at the end that I wanted to make sure I got into the podcast. And he said, "There has been no better education in my life of what it means to be an American than living in a different culture. In my experience, most people the world over are not so different from one another as the news likes to show. After all, everyone wants the best for their children and a desire for fairness. Oh, how I wish everyone in the U.S., and the world for that matter, could spend a year or two abroad in their formative years. Clay's daughter knows this well, I have no doubt."
Well, Jefferson said that you don't begin to understand the blessings of being an American until you live abroad. And he said every American who can should come see Europe, and they will then fall in love with their own country again. And although that was then and this is now, and we've stumbled a little in the last few decades in this respect, I do think that America continues to be a magic word in the world, and our experiment in self-government continues to be something extraordinarily important in world history, and people look to us. And I think the fact that our guardrails held and that we've had essentially a peaceful transfer of power, that one group of people is out, another group of people is in, and we move on. I think that is, and the temperature has, I believe, come down a little bit since then. I think that's good news. I think it's good news that we are re-engaging with the European community and not being as abrasive towards it as we have been for a time here. So these are good things. And I learned so much by living abroad. You know what I miss most, though, in all those years was the American West, was Yellowstone, Glacier, Yosemite, Arches, Utah, Montana, the great
Theodore
thunderstorms.
Roosevelt National Park.
Indeed, I just missed the fact that America, not uniquely among nations, but nearly uniquely among nations, has set aside vast parts of itself for recreation and for permanent enjoyment of the sublime. And by the way, that harkens back to our man Thomas Jefferson, who was talking this way in the late 18th century. And so we owe so much to him, and then, of course, 100 years later to Theodore Roosevelt, who set aside 230 million acres of the public domain as permanent national park, national monument, national wildlife refuge, national game preserve, etc. And so, yes, and you also learn that America has a sense of itself when you travel, when you live abroad. You learn that our own sense of ourself doesn't always play well in Europe, and they're more skeptical of us than we are of ourselves. And that's really good. That's the ideal debating society, because you find yourself driven back on your heels a lot. I'm sure that Matt will agree with me. You're driven back on your heels and you're being asked to sort of justify and defend America. And you think when you start it's going to be so easy, but it turns out it's actually quite a challenge. And that makes you realize those parts of our national behavior and our national practice that are thin and that may work for us in our national self-mythology, but they actually strike other people around the world as less pure, and often they see the hypocrisy or what they perceive to be the hypocrisy in some of our attitudes in the world. So it's very useful to look from Europe or from Asia back at the United States. Yes.
He references that in his letter, the sort of the questions that he gets about America and Americans. It's a lengthy letter. Again, I encourage you to read it, but he does say, by the destinies of geography, I live in the area that Mr. Jefferson passed through. He speaks about a city in Italy, Racconigi. Jefferson passed through that on April 16th, 1787. He says there's a magnificent palace there, only 12 miles away from his house, and he wonders if Jefferson set foot inside that. He also talks about visiting a historic library in Turin, and as he browsed through the thousands of old books, he couldn't help but wonder if Jefferson had also walked those halls. Do you have any information on any of that?
And I don't think Jefferson got to Turin, but I know that he got to Milan. I'm planning a cultural tour. We're actually going to go over the Alps. Jefferson, in his nerdy way, was trying to figure out how Hannibal got his elephants through the passes of the Alps. He was tooling around up there. He was probably wrong, but it's great that he was even thinking about it. And then he dropped down into the northern Italian landscape. He did not get as far as the great Palladian centers, Vicenza in Italy, and he certainly didn't get to Rome. He would have been thrilled to see Pompeii and Herculaneum. Those were these recently dug up ruins from the disaster of the explosion of Mount Vesuvius, and this is the kind of thing that would have just thrilled Thomas Jefferson. But he was such a believer in duty that he knew that he had no ostensible mission, no credible reason for descending that far down the peninsula of Italy, that it would be hard to justify this because it was really just pure self-indulgence. It was not part of being an American minister to France. And so he stopped. And I think Joe's right. He should have gone on. I think if he had sat in front of the Pantheon, he might be sitting there still. So I really love that. But I want to say something else about this before we go to the show. A great thing happened this last week, my dear friend David, and that is the landing of the probe Perseverance on Mars.
Oh, I am so wired up about that. I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, it's like, why isn't this the lead item on every news broadcast?
Just the idea that we can, first of all, it's a triumph of the Newtonian, that we can send a probe from the United States on the planet Earth, and that it will go 300 million miles across the solar system and wind up on the spot where it's intended to be on another celestial object on Mars, and that it can land gently and deploy a probe and have digital photographs that are then transmitted back to Earth, and it's going to wander around, and it's going to have a relatively long shelf life, and it's going to probe the concern that we have about life on other celestial bodies. Was there once life on Mars? And if so, what form did it take? And perhaps more to the point, what happened to it? And is there anything we can learn from all of this? All of this would have just completely floored Jefferson. He would have just wept for joy. He would have gotten out his telescopes. He would have read everything he could have read about it. And that was then. Imagine today. I mean, he would just be glued to this. He wouldn't want to talk about anything else, because this is not only the continuation of the idea of exploration, which is really something, but more importantly, it's such a deep window into the triumph of Newtonian mechanics. It proves that the universe does work, that gravitation works exactly the way Newton said it did, that propulsion works exactly as Robert Goddard showed, that we can actually tune our own technologies to the larger mechanics of the solar system and harmonize with this celestial clock that nature's God has presented to us. There's just so much joy in it, and it's so sad that we don't give it more attention than we have, because it's way more symbolic of what is great about human civilization than all of the stuff that we wind up wrestling with all the time.
Well, we're recording this on the Monday, February 22nd, and by the time the show airs, which will be a couple of weeks from now, who knows what more will have been discovered and sent back. Before we go to the show, can you update us on what's going on with your many endeavors, sir?
Yes, so coming up, and I urge people to do this, I can't wait, Hamlet, 4 Saturdays on Shakespeare's Hamlet, including watching films and clips from films, and we'll go over passages, and we'll play parts of the play, and I'm going to do a sort of scene-by-scene, almost line-by-line commentary. Hamlet is, without question, my very favorite piece of literature. Jefferson never mentions Hamlet, so it's hard to know what he thought of it. If anything, he mentions Macbeth and King Lear. But that's coming up in April, 4 sessions. And then in May, 4 sessions on the literature of the Great Plains. You know, lots of people say, why do you live in North Dakota? And what is it about the Great Plains that you love so much? And so I'm doing this course, and we'll be reading O.E. Rolvag's great novel, Giants in the Earth, which is maybe the greatest thing ever written about the Great Plains, but also Willa Cather's My Antonia, and a North Dakota woman's diary called Dust Bowl Diary, which was written during the 1930s, and then Kent Heroff's Plain Song. So lots and lots and lots going on.
Shall we go to the show?
Let us go to the show. Mr. Joseph Ellis, the returning champion, here to answer listener questions on this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks, everyone.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we are joined by the creator of the Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and also by our returning champion, one of our favorite guests, Professor Joseph Ellis. I'm your host, David Swenson, and gentlemen, welcome to the both of you.
Hey, David, pleasure to be with you. I'm coming to you from the mountains of Vermont, and the dog's barking upstairs because it's snowing blazes here. I look out over my deck, and I'm about 1 inch short of 6 feet tall, and I'm not as tall as the snow piled up on the deck.
Oh, I wish we had some of that. We just get cold weather, no snow. This week, gentlemen, I have a stack of email, and most all of it was generated by your last appearance on the program, Mr. Ellis, and that was an episode titled Argument is the Answer. Do you recall?
I do, but I'm already worried that it's all hate mail.
No, not at all. Not at all. Let me start with a letter from Scott Stewart, who listens on radio, KUND. He says, your latest episode, Argument is the Answer, was very good, as usual. Well, thank you for that, Scott. You referenced getting rid of the filibuster and the Electoral College to better reflect a democracy, but missed a third, which is gerrymandering.
Agree with that. I completely agree. And I think Clay would add a fourth. Clay, you tell me whether I'm representing you correctly. We need to redo the Senate so that it is less unrepresentative. I know that's not going to sound good out there in the Dakotas, but it doesn't sound that good to people in Vermont either. But right now, even though it's even in terms of Democrats, Republicans, the Democrats in the Senate represent almost twice as many people as the Republicans, and we need to make some changes there.
I'm with you, Joe. I think I like Larry Sabato's idea of increasing the size of the Senate to 135. I think that would preserve the 2 minimal senators for each state, which is written, as you know, directly into the Constitution and was the result of the Great Compromise of July 17th, 1787. My own view would be to keep it at 100 and give states like Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, Wyoming the mandatory 1, and then work all the way up to 5 for states like California, Texas, and Florida. But I think that's an unlikely constitutional adjustment, but I think some of the others are more likely. Filibuster. Anyone who looks at filibuster will see that it really has largely been used by those that wanted to protect either slavery or Jim Crow legislation, Jim Crow laws. And so the filibuster has been a way to prevent social change in the United States. I think it needs to go. I would end cloture, too. I would say that a 51% majority in the Senate, like a 51% majority in the House, produces legislation.
I agree. I think that the Congress of the United States is a place where legislation goes to die right now, and there's nothing in the Constitution concerning the filibuster. It's an addition. It's a parliamentary addition made in the 19th century. There's a kind of popular view of the filibuster that has a certain appeal, Jeffersonian appeal, really. When it's Jimmy Stewart, remember that Mr. Smith comes to Washington?
Sure.
And he stands up and defends the rights of the Boy Scouts out there and wherever it was. But that version of the filibuster has been dead for 50 years. Nobody has to do anything like stand up for hours to talk. All they got to do is indicate that they oppose something. And I think that if the United States does wish to be a nation state that plays a role in world affairs, that we've got to have a government that's capable of passing laws rather than just executive orders that get changed by the next president.
You know, Joe, Scott's question was really about the gerrymandering. And so one quick question. Why is it Elbridge Gerry, but then it's gerrymander?
Elbridge Gerry was governor of Massachusetts in the early, during the Jefferson administration, as a matter of fact. And he's the originator of maybe you know more about this than I do, but he's the guy that rearranged congressional districts for Federalist purposes at that time. That is the Federalist Party. Now, however, because they've got computer programs, they can do this much more effectively. The Republicans are better at it than the Democrats, but it's a way of organizing congressional districts in ways that make no geographic sense, but make political sense if you want to enhance the power of your own party. I think that one of the ways to try to get rid of it is to place redistricting of congressional districts, that happens after every census, not in the hands of the state legislatures, but in the hands of federal judges from that particular region, or maybe retired judges who are just looking for things to do, but take it out of the hands of the state legislatures.
Agreed. Go ahead, David.
This question comes from Paul Zanger. He's a listener on public radio station KVNF in western Colorado. He writes, lately you have expounded upon the idea of redistributing seats in the U.S. Senate to represent population. States with greater populations would have 3 to 5 Senate seats. States with small populations would have 1. One of the great debates in our world today circles around the urban-rural divide. This is certainly true at the state level in Colorado. Rural parts of Colorado have a limited voice in the state house, which appears to result in a certain level of disenfranchisement. We have less funding for schools, some of the poorest in the state. We have poorer opportunities for communication, broadband, internet, etc., and less spending is realized for transportation, often resulting in continuously brutal traffic accidents. Some parts of the rural West exhibit some of the most difficult pockets of poverty, and this cuts across lines of ethnicity and language. So my question is, how is taking away the voices of rural parts of the country at the federal level Jeffersonian?
I'll just take a very quick swing at this, Clay, and you probably can hit the ball better than I. The short answer, it is not Jeffersonian, and that Jefferson's view of popular representation did not foresee that kind of gerrymandered situation. And so at some level, if you could reincarnate him at all and bring him back, he would say, yes, I'm in favor of reform. I haven't focused as much as on the state level, rural versus urban problem that the writer is identifying. But it's just a smaller, it's a microscopic version of the macroscopic problem. If we do really believe in the principles of democracy, representation itself, and what, you know, in a way that is true to the collective interest of the state rather than any segment, must be the guide. And how you go about changing that at the state level is not something I can answer right away, but that should be a goal if you're a real Jeffersonian.
I'm sort of the odd man out with the two of you about the makeup of the Senate. I'm with this gentleman. I worry about rural representation. You know, Clay makes a good argument. Why should a state as small as the one I live in have as many senators as a state as huge as New York or Texas or California? But to me, that's the spirit of the Senate. And to disenfranchise rural voters by cutting back on their representation just doesn't seem right. That's what the House is for.
All right, but let's look at it this way, to Paul's question. So if you believe that the Senate should stay as the Constitution makers designed it, 2 senators from each state, period, I can live with that, but we must get rid of the capacity of the Senate to hold up the nation's business. So filibuster, cloture, the huge power that the Senate Majority Leader has to determine what gets on the floor and what doesn't, those things really have taken the idea of the Senate into an absurd extreme, so that in the last few years, for example, Mitch McConnell has been such a powerful Senate Majority Leader that he actually determines what will get voted on and what won't. And so if you're going to have a Senate that's going to stay at 2, then we should at least make sure it works by majority rule. And at the moment, except on questions of reconciliation for bills of appropriation, it takes 60 votes to get something done in the Senate. And I can promise you that that's not what the founding fathers had in mind. They wanted the House to be closer to the people with 2-year terms and more of them. And then they wanted the Senate to be at some remove. And they wanted the Senate to be sort of a cooling dish for the more volatile House. And so that would be true anyway. But if you give the Senate this problem that anything that worth doing has to get 60 votes, that's a supermajority. And that's a direct violation of the Jeffersonian principle of majority rule. So I would settle for that. As to rural Colorado, in most states, and I can't speak for Paul's Colorado, but in most states, the cities complain that the rural districts have inordinate power and that the cities have to bend over backwards to please the rural districts because they've been gerrymandered to protect rural Colorado, rural Montana, rural Wyoming, and so on. So I don't know the actual demographics of Colorado, but I'll bet both sides complain bitterly about the other. The urban people in Seattle complain about those people in eastern Washington, and the people in eastern Washington complain about the urban world of Seattle and Tacoma and Olympia. I think that's universal, don't you think, Joe?
I do. I agree. David's argument makes me think of what could be, if you wanted to have an argument here, a dialogue. That's to what extent should representatives in the Senate represent space rather than population? That's the real issue there. And I think Jefferson is in favor of population. But that essentially what we've got is a situation in which the middle of the country, which includes the Dakotas, of course, has more representation because of its size than because of its population.
Yeah, you've done it to me again, Joe. Now I'm going to have to...
I'm sorry, have I done something bad?
No, I'm going to have to rethink my whole position on that. And thankfully, we have a short break coming so I can do that.
Okay.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, we're so pleased to have Mr. Clay Jenkinson and Professor Joseph Ellis answering questions. And we have a question from a British listener. It comes from Ben Clemson. He says, "Love the podcast. As a British listener, I am dispensed to find some redemption for the British. After the war, how were the Loyalists treated? And how does this compare to the Reconstruction after the Civil War? And is there any sense that the British conducted the war with relative civility?"
Joe, let me start by denouncing the British, since I'm the Jefferson guy here. Jefferson said once, you remember to Abigail Adams, he said, "I find that it is in their gastronomical tracts that the British must be reformed. The sheer quantity of animal flesh that these people eat renders them insusceptible of civilization."
I remember that.
Let me try to be the historian here for a second, and that is that during the course of the War for Independence, approximately 500,000 people were loyalists. That is, they did not agree with the commitment to secede from the British Empire. Of that number, about a tenth, 50,000, left the country under their own power and ended up mostly in Canada, first in Nova Scotia, then New Brunswick, then Ontario, but some of them went back to England, some of them went to the Caribbean, some of them ended up in India, but that a majority of the Loyalists stayed, and they were persecuted during the war, but unlike the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, if you were a Girondist in the French Revolution, you were going to get killed by the Jacobins, and you would go to the guillotine. And that didn't happen to the Loyalists. The Loyalists were ostracized, but they were not killed. And one of the reasons there's such a large diaspora after the American Revolution is they were free to go somewhere else. Most of them, however, stayed where they were, and not they, but their children and grandchildren were accepted back into the community, and they remained Americans loyal to the new nation. The author's review comment about and by the way, if you were in the war as an American patriot and you encountered a British army unit that was dominated by loyalists, you could expect no quarter. The loyalists were the most barbaric, along with the Hessians. And British officers moving through the back country to forage. Let's say there's a guy called Simcoe who's an Oxford graduate, and he would simply stand aside as the troops went in, raped the women, hung the men, and burned the house down. So that there was some pretty serious savagery committed, a lot by the loyalist troops, who were more barbaric than the other British, and the British officers complained about that. But in recent years, the Loyalists have been studied by American historians much more sympathetically than in previous decades. And in some ways, they're seen as the victims of the American Revolution, and can understand that because they were persecuted. But I'm trying to provide a balanced view here that says they were persecuted, but they were not killed. After the war, compare it to the Civil War, their estates were confiscated. In the Treaty of Paris, their estates were supposed to be returned if they had never borne arms against the United States. But most states didn't respect that. And it's interesting because leaders of the black community now talking about reparations are saying that after the Civil War, they should have divided up the southern plantations and given the land to the freed slaves. There was some talk about that, but it never amounted to much, the 40 acres and a mule. And the black population of the United States now owns approximately 10% of the wealth of the white community. I mean, the average black family has 10% wealth of what the average white family does, and they've never completely recovered from that. That's perhaps a too long-winded an answer, but the Loyalists, you should know, are now being studied by American historians much more sympathetically.
We don't have a lot of listeners in Britain, so we don't want to lose this guy. And so he asks, maybe you could answer this, Clay, is there any sense that the British conducted the war with relative civility?
Yes, I mean, this was the 18th century, and there were exceptions, of course. Joe has mentioned a couple of them, but this was an era of, by our standards, gentlemanly war between known combatants on known fields, and the Americans shocked and really upset the British by fighting a guerrilla war when the British expected there to be sort of the European model of Army A squaring off against Army B. And some people shoot and others kneel, and then others shoot and they kneel, and so on. And the Americans realized early on that they could win a war of attrition by a more guerrilla approach. I have a quick story for both of you. Jefferson's cousin John Randolph, not the famous John Randolph, the other one, was a loyalist. He and Jefferson had this pact. Jefferson coveted John Randolph's violin. And so the pact was that if John Randolph died first, Jefferson would get the violin. But if Jefferson died first, Randolph would get $100 worth of Jefferson's books from his library. Well, the war came, and John Randolph decided to leave the country and go live in England. And so Jefferson wrote to him and said, hey, about that violin. And Randolph gave it to him. He left it behind when he went back to Britain, and Jefferson was so pleased to have it. But it's so typical of Jefferson that in the midst of this world crisis, a war for the survival of the American independence movement, Jefferson's like, yeah, if you're going to go back, maybe we should work that thing out about the violin deal. And he got it. It was one of the 3 violins that Jefferson owned.
I want to agree with what you said about part of the violin story, but about the nature of 18th century warfare, with a caveat, however, that our image of the Revolutionary War is kind of misguided. It's sort of polite exchange between two sides. The actual casualty rate in the American War for Independence was higher than any war in American history except the Civil War. And if you were hit in the chest, you had a 50% chance of dying. And there was a premium put on discipline in the ranks, and you had to stand at attention while the guy next to you was beheaded or disemboweled. And most of the combat was hand-to-hand and bayonet to bayonet. Civility wasn't, it wasn't a civil war. I mean, it was a civil war in the sense that you're referring to it, but and if you're living in the countryside in western New Jersey or Pennsylvania, you're and the foraging patrols from each side come through, you're in a hopeless situation because you either give your food to the British, and then when the Americans come through, they're going to punish you, or the other way around. And so it's a kind of dirty, nasty war that's it doesn't look like a Trumbull painting makes it seem.
There was a lot of confiscation, so whichever army happened into your district, they're taking your hay, your horses, some of your food, whatever they need, and it's the confiscations. If the Americans were doing it, they would say, well, we'll pay you back later, but that almost never happened.
Yeah, they gave them what they call certificates, who were worthless. I think that in the end, the Americans could control the countryside. That's the big thing that made the war unwinnable from the British side. And one British naval officer said it was like a ship going through the seas, and the wave closed over the wake of the ship. As soon as the British left, the locals took over, and that was militia usually. So it was far from Jefferson's finest hour when he's governor of Virginia, and the British Army comes into Virginia, and he has to flee the governorship and even flee Monticello. And he doesn't look Churchillian at that moment. He comes under enormous criticism from, say, Patrick Henry, and they want to have him censored, and it stuck with him for the rest of his life. It's not quite fair to Jefferson. What was he supposed to stay there and be captured? And but he doesn't come off well at that moment in his history.
In fact, Joe, there's another problem for Jefferson, and I'm sure you were aware of Leonard Levy's book, Jefferson and Civil Liberties. But when the hair buyer Hamilton, not our Hamilton, but the British General Hamilton, was captured, he was brought to Virginia into Albemarle County, and Jefferson treated him very, very badly. He put him in irons. He wouldn't give him access to pens and paper and books. He was violating such codes of war as existed at the time. And this really became an issue. And George Washington finally had to write to Jefferson and say, lighten up a little on Hamilton because you're behaving in a kind of barbaric way to a prisoner. And that prisoner needs to be treated with dignity, especially if he's from the class of gentlemen in England.
It's true. And the British were not nice to American prisoners of war either. The major prisoner of war camp was in New York on the east side of the East River. 18,000 Americans were imprisoned there. 11,000 of them died. And they threw their bodies into the East River and they washed up to the shores of Manhattan. Not pleasant. A guy called Joshua Loring, a loyalist, was in charge of that. And yes, I'll stop there.
Yeah, you're not giving a lot of redemption to our British listener, but I hope he continues to listen, and thanks for your letter, Ben. As long as we're in Europe, I have another one from Europe. This one comes from Matt Halsdorf. He's an American in his early 40s living in Italy. He was born and raised in Southern California, but he's been living in Europe for 17 years now. And he thanks us for the show and says he knows it's not always easy to step out the front door in the cold of the Dakota winter, but he appreciates our efforts. He lives in a small village of about 2,000 people in the northwest region of Italy named Piedmont, a name well known by our friend of Monticello, he says. He's a business English trainer. He gets asked a lot of questions about America because he's the local Americano, as he puts it. And he has a very interesting suggestion for a show. He says, when an immigrant wishes to become a U.S. citizen, they must prepare for a civics test. This test has recently been expanded, and perhaps Mr. Jefferson could go through this test and not only answer as many questions as possible, but explain why these questions are important for a citizen to know. I think that's a very interesting idea.
Well, it goes to Joe's view. Joe has been saying that Americans should have to take the naturalization test, the citizenship test ourselves, and I think your sense is we wouldn't fare very well, Joe.
No, about 30 to 40% of the high school graduates in the United States would be able to pass the test, I'm afraid. And I think that I'm a firm believer that part of the reason it's difficult for us to argue with each other now and to have the kind of dialogue that this program is trying to exhibit is that people are ignorant of the facts of American history, basic facts in ways like did the revolution come before or after the Civil War? I'm not kidding. And that they're therefore vulnerable to misinformation and to crazy conspiracy theories, which are delusional and simply, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And so I'm an advocate for state-based decisions to make the civics test a requirement that all high school graduates have to take. A lot of states have state history requirements, but I'm looking for something larger than that. And then I would a real interesting argument we could have is about what should the civics test look like? There are divisions within the American historical profession on that score, and let's bring it on and have that and make the argument itself. In the end, the Constitution isn't a collection of truths. It's a framework in which we can argue about what the truths are. In the end, the founders were great because they were a diverse group of people who didn't agree. If you just left the future to Jefferson, I'm afraid we'd be headed towards some form of anarchy. If we let it in the hands of Hamilton, I think it would be headed towards authoritarianism. And it's the collision among those different temperaments that creates a kind of constitutional balance as well as the Constitution itself. But it only works if you've got people who are sufficiently informed to be able to have a cogent conversation.
To Matt, I say, get me a job in Italy. I'm on my way to the Piedmont. Yes, I'll take that test, David. So let's do that. let's set up a time if we can get a hold of a copy, and I'll take the test as Jefferson, and if I fail, then we'll cancel the show.
Noted, sir. It's quite a nice letter. If you haven't read it, Clay, I know it's in your inbox. You should take a look. It's pretty lengthy, and I've just excerpted parts of it. But he does say that by the destinies of geography, he lives in the area that Mr. Jefferson passed through on his little diversion out of France. And he's curious, Clay or Joe, if either of you have any books you might be able to recommend on his trip into Italy.
Yes, there are great books on this subject, and so we'll post them on the Jefferson Hour site, and I'll respond directly to Matt about that. I'm actually working on a project with a man named John Bessler, who is a scholar of the great Italian humanist Beccaria, and Beccaria's treatise on crimes and punishment of 1764 had a huge impact on the founding generation, and particularly Jefferson. And so that we're going to do this dialogue in Milan whenever the green light comes from COVID. And so I've been working on this. I wanted to lead a cultural tour over the Alps as Jefferson went in 1787, and he was on a wine tour of France, and he was looking at canals, and he was trying to learn more about how the peasant culture of France were faring. And
also an architecture.
A sociological trip through France, and of course enamored of neoclassical architecture and ancient Roman architecture. And he was at the Maison Quarré in Nîmes, which he said was the most beautiful building of antiquity, and he used it as the design base for the new capital at Richmond and so on. Well, he got over the Alps. He went to Milan. He didn't go any farther. He said he only got what he called a peep into Elysium. He wanted to get all the way to Naples to see Pompeii, and also, of course, wanted to get to Rome, which was much more of a pastoral ruin than it has since become. But he didn't. And so, yes, we know the itinerary. And
I taught a course on Jefferson and Monticello one time, and I had an art historian there from Williams come in, and he started saying Jefferson's big mistake was not to go all the way to Rome. That if he had gone all the way to Rome, he would have seen things architecturally that would have made Monticello a fundamentally different building. And that the Palladian architecture that enamored him was being revised in a major way by Roman architects at that time, and in a more, and he thought, more aesthetically attractive way. But if only he had gone to Rome, all American architecture would be somewhat different. And he made this argument anyway.
Well, he said that
interesting.
He looked at the Hôtel de Somme, which was the home of the French Legion of Honor, which became the rebuild model for Monticello, but also at the Maison Quarré in Nîmes. And he said that he wrote a letter to one of his female friends back in Paris, and said, "Here I sit, madam, like looking at this building like a lover at his mistress." And I can tell you, Joe, that I've spent a lot of time in Rome, and I always go sit at a cafe in front of the Pantheon, and I look at it for hour after hour like a lover at his mistress. And I get it. If he had seen the Pantheon, I think he might have had a completely different aesthetic when he got home.
What woman was he writing? Clay, who was he writing to then?
Madame de Tessa, I think.
It wasn't the woman that he had a crush on.
No, Maria Cosway. No, he was writing her racier letters.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break. When we come back, Joe, I have a question for you, something that came up on last week's show about Abigail Adams, if that would be all right.
Sure.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and Professor Joseph Ellis. And Joe, I have a question for you. Last week I had a conversation with President Jefferson, and we talked about the Sedition Act. And at one point in the program, I asked about Abigail Adams' influence on John Adams when it came to the Sedition Act. And I believe you had an opinion on that.
Yes. I mean, it's an opinion based on reading the Adams family correspondence, which is the most revealing correspondence between two prominent Americans in American history, I think. Abigail was always a mentor to John and a voice, and almost always her advice was good. In this one instance, in 1799 or 1798-99, she strongly supported the passage and enforcement of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which has subsequently been a tin can tied to the tail of Adams for the rest of his career and legacy. It's because John was being vilified in the Republican press. Funny, one of this New Jersey newspapermen, his weekly was called The Wasp, said that Adams was just a big ass. And Abigail said to John, "How does he know you have a big ass? I'm the only person that knows you have a big ass. And you do have a big ass." But that guy ought to go to jail. And he did, as a matter of fact. And that's one of the few mistakes she made in terms of the kind of political advice she offered to her husband. And one of the things about the Sedition Acts, it was legislation that allowed the federal government to censor and to close down press that was critical of the current administration. But in the Sedition Act, for the first time in American law, truth was a defense. And in American law, ever since, truth has been a viable defense against prosecution.
Joe, let me ask you this question, because we were talking about this last week. Adams himself did not originate the Alien, Sedition, and Naturalization laws. He signed them.
High Federalists under Hamilton.
And so what was his actual attitude toward them? I think he was somewhat hesitant and then later embarrassed.
Yes, he was hesitant. And then you remember this in the correspondence with Jefferson later on, when it comes up, he writes Jefferson, "What are you accusing me of this for? You signed it too, as vice president," which he did. I mean, and he oversaw the debate in the Senate over this thing. But Jefferson opposed it in all other ways. He knew it was a mistake after he made it, and it was a mistake. But I think that I'm not sure how I can end this, but it's that he wanted to try to get Jefferson blamed for it as much as him. And the real people were the high Federalists in the Congress that were pushing this agenda, who hated Adams, by the way.
How big a factor was this, Joe, in the election of 1800? Was it a factor?
Yes, it was, although it's hard to know how much. They didn't have pollsters to tell us this, but yeah, it was a consideration. It was one of the things that the Jeffersonian Party used against the Federalists.
So Jefferson said it was worthy of the 9th or 10th centuries, that it was a palpable violation of the Bill of Rights. How would you evaluate that claim?
I think he's right. I want to put it in the context in terms of Anglo-American law. In some part, it's an advancement, as I'm saying, but it's the start of a legacy that we can see later on in the prosecution of people after, in the Red Scare and in the McCarthy Scare. It conjures up that legacy of using federal power to suppress free speech. I think it's going to come up again in the near future, because I do think we're going to have to regulate the internet, and the right to free speech is a very, very, very crucial principle. And at what point can you sacrifice some of that in order to clear up some of the nonsense that goes on in the internet?
Well, Jefferson told me, in no uncertain terms, you cannot. That's part of it when I spoke with him directly. So,
well, if he's speaking to you, he doesn't talk to me anymore.
Joe, I could set it up for you anytime. You just let me know. I don't know how I came into this power, but I have it. I have a question from a Mitchell Reinhardt who listens on WHRV in Norfolk. And this is kind of an interesting question. I don't know if either one of you can answer it. If I was to become a staffer for the Jefferson gubernatorial, ministerial, or presidential administration, or perhaps a student at the University of Virginia, what would my resume or application look like? What education or previous experience would I need to be fit for the position?
Well, Jefferson, this is another, unfortunately, another blemish on Jefferson's long and distinguished life. But when he created the University of Virginia, he did it in part because he didn't want poor, innocent Virginians going up to Harvard and Yale and all those Yankee and New England places where they would be turned into crabby Calvinist Presbyterian Federalists. And so he wanted to train his local boys, all boys, in Virginia. And then once they had the university, which is one of the world's most extraordinary institutions now, he also set the curriculum. And he made sure that only books that were Republican, small r Republican, in their political outlook were taught. And because he thought Hume's History of England was so good, but so damaged by Hume's Toryism, that he actually encouraged somebody to rewrite Hume and remove all of the Tory references from it so that it would be acceptable in the curriculum at UVA. And so this is hardly the free marketplace of ideas.
Now, there's an exchange between him and Madison at some point in time that you might remember because Madison's saying, wait a minute, I do think you want to put the Federalist Papers here. And Jefferson didn't have him in the list. And Madison's trying to address the question that you're raising. I might add, as a graduate of the College of William and Mary, as I am, the other thing that Jefferson wished to correct was to put in place a state university that was not religiously affiliated. The College of William and Mary was an Anglican-based institution, and it was part of his commitment to a total separation of church and state. And UVA was the first college in the United States that had no religious affiliation whatsoever.
And there he was right, I think. I think his idea that
I think he was too. Yeah.
Truth can only occur when there is not a religious foundation, because if there is a religious foundation, you're going to butt up against the divinity of Christ, for example, and then truth is going to be stymied because that's faith, not something that can be ascertained by reason.
The last thing, at UVA, there were no academic requirements. Everybody took whatever they wanted, he or she wanted to. Jefferson really believed in that. And he also believed in the honor system. And within 6 months, they had these riots there, and the students were destroying parts of the dorms and stuff. And he was very unhappy with the fact that people couldn't discipline themselves.
He came down actually on his horse, and he called a meeting. This was the first class ever at UVA, and there were like 20 of them or 25, and they rioted. There was a town gown brawl, and they attacked one of the professors and so on. And Jefferson came down from the mountain. He was ancient by now, and he rode down and he called the students together and he wept. He wept in front of them like, this was my great idealistic dream, and you turn out to be the usual college louts.
But back to Mr. Reinhardt's question, if you were to become a staffer, what kind of things would Jefferson have demanded?
Well, only that they have an open mind so that he could persuade them that he was the person who knew more than anyone else about what this country needed. In other words, he's happy to take someone from Dartmouth or Princeton or Harvard or Yale as long as he can convert them.
He's probably right about that. I think that the interesting question is, suppose this person had gone to school at Oxford, Cambridge, or the Middle Temple, which a lot of people from South Carolina and Virginia went to because they didn't have any they didn't have equal opportunities. Would he regarded that after the Revolution as a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad. This was a time when Oxford was in actually a period of great mediocrity. And Jefferson once said, the only thing you learn from a European education is boxing, wenching, and horse betting.
We have a couple of letters that mention you directly, Mr. Ellis. One from Jeff Barber, who writes, I recently finished reading Joseph Ellis's Founding Brothers, and it has reignited my interest in history. As such, I was searching for podcasts and found that Dr. Ellis was a regular guest on our show, and he really enjoys the program. And he goes on to ask about our Jefferson 101 shows. And Jeff, I'm going to look into that for you and we'll respond. But we did a series of shows, Clay. You remember the Jefferson 101 series.
Yeah, we were going to do like 6 programs on Jefferson's life. It wound up being 20-something because he's such a fascinating historical character. Joe, we were going kind of decade by decade or episode by episode in Jefferson's life. And as you know, it just gets more interesting in every direction. So Jefferson is one of those people whose presidency was in some ways the least important and interesting time of his life.
I agree. I mean, he didn't even put it on his tombstone and as an achievement. I mean, I think it's interesting that the first 4 to 5 presidents of the United States did not regard their presidency as the capstone of their career. They regarded it as an epilogue. They'd all achieved something prior to that they regarded as much more important. In Jefferson's case, the Declaration of Independence and the war, and same with Washington, winning the war, and Adams in leading the debate in the Continental Congress before the war, and Madison the Constitutional Convention, so that people sometimes think that I'm a presidential historian, and I've written biographies about the first 3 presidents. I'm not a presidential historian. I mean, and the presidency was not regarded then with the same degree of exalted significance that it is now.
Here's another one from a Richmond listener, William Burnett. He writes, I enjoyed Jefferson in character as well as Clay discussing Jefferson as a historian. I understand the show has become more politically topical this last year. As a longtime listener, I support your discussion of current events. I needed your perspective. He says he does take issue, Clay, with you for equating Fox and MSNBC. Ari Melber and Rachel Maddow report a lot of factual content that sometimes leads me to a different conclusion than is implied by the narrator. Fox leaves out facts and invents others. I do not rely on MSNBC for news. It is commentary. And since Fox News transitions from news to commentary, the difference is obscured. He ends by saying, keep up the good work. I enjoy Joseph Ellis. Watch out, he might start the John Adams Hour.
Oh, that would only last for 3 or 4 weeks, and then you've run out of Adams. You know,
I would not succeed in that. If it was anything like the way Clay and you have succeeded out there. Though I think that Adams is always going to be a good person to put into a Jeffersonian conversation. And
absolutely.
And as you know, Clay, I think that the revolution only is complete when you get Jefferson and Adams together and see the both sides of it. The commentator's question is interesting to me because as a historian who tries to believe and act on the principle that we need to recover the past on its own terms and not just bringing our own political agenda to bear on it, and then the answers then become self-evident in a kind of naive way. But it's and I'm a citizen as well as a historian. I'm alive and kicking, I hope, in this difficult moment in our political life. And I think we should have a dialogue across time to try to see if there's any wisdom back there that can help us negotiate this. But I do, whenever we cross that line and engage in comparisons with contemporary political events, there's a group of people that are upset. And I've had lots of mail from, say, I always liked you as a historian. Just be a historian. Don't start writing about things that are contemporary. And I did a book called American Dialogue, which is about then and now. And I can't do that. I got to be able to straddle the past and the present. And I think that's what historians should try to do responsibly. And we need to be able to, this is back to the same, we need to be able to argue together. And this show is committed to that principle in a way that I find extraordinarily important.
There's an author that I enjoy so much that you made me think of, and that's William Schreier. And you're a historian, and so was he. And I would read his books and just admire his style. And at the end, I would always but what did you think? Well, why don't you tell me what you thought? And then came the Berlin Diaries, and that's what he did. So there's a little parallel there. We're about out of time, Clay. I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, first of all, thanks to Joe. Of course, we'll keep doing this, and the more correspondence we get to put questions to Joe.
And do you have a response for William Burnett?
I would say this. I don't draw a moral equivalency between Fox and MSNBC. I think that they're quite different in their commitment to ascertainable facts. On the other hand, the problem is not that. The problem is that the people who are siloed in Fox believe that MSNBC represents the Antichrist, and the people who are at MSNBC regard the people who watch Fox as listening to the Antichrist. And so that's the problem. And I think that it's wrong for MSNBC to have so few conservatives on. It almost always is interviewing people of its own political stamp. Actually, Fox tries a little bit harder to have somebody who's not conservative on, but Fox is more dedicated to a sort of, I think, propaganda about conservative republicanism and Trumpism. And so they're both, in my opinion, vulnerable, and they don't represent the best of the American tradition. I see that tradition as seen, say, in CBS during its great years between 1960 and 1980, Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, or on NBC, John Chancellor. These were extraordinary news magazines and news shows that tried very hard to provide something like a centrist approach to American political life. And I think we have lost something important. And that's the moral equivalency that I think between these two cable stations produces more partisanship, more division, more mutual distrust, and a kind of a tribally separated America.
Just before the inauguration, I got a call email from Fox News, and they said, we want you to help do the inauguration assessment. And I said, you sure you got the right guy? And they said, yes, we respect your work and we want to hear your perspective. And so I did it.
That's excellent.
They were open to that. And it wasn't anti-Trump or pro. It was just talking about the history of inaugural addresses, really. And we need a little bit more of that.
This week has flown by, gentlemen. Thank you both so very much.
Thank you, David, for being our broker and our interlocutor and the one who fields the questions. We'll see you all next week for another exciting and important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.